They dragged him out of first class like he was trash. No warning, no reason, just the silent judgment that his black skin didn't belong beside suits and silverware. He didn't argue. He didn't cry. He stood up in front of the entire cabin, heart pounding, humiliated in front of passengers who looked away like it wasn't happening. No one asked his name. No one cared who he was. But the twist they never saw coming? He was someone powerful enough to tear their system apart without raising his voice. This isn't just a story about racism. It's about what happens when the one they try to erase turns out to be the one holding all the cards. If you're watching this, hit like, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And how would you have reacted if that had been you in his seat? Jaden Cole stepped into the first-class cabin of Flight 227 with a cautious kind of pride, the kind that tried not to look too impressed while still taking it all in. He moved carefully through the polished aisle, past rows of wealthy passengers who hardly looked up, and found his assigned seat, 2A by the window. This wasn't just another trip for him. It was his first time flying first class, a seat he paid for himself with money earned from a national STEM competition that had earned him a scholarship and, briefly, a sense of being seen for his talents. But even now, surrounded by plush leather and quiet jazz filtering through the cabin speakers, he felt like an outsider. At 17, he was no stranger to strange looks, and the moment he stepped foot into that cabin, he knew the glances would come. He placed his backpack gently in the overhead bin, settled into the wide seat, and took a deep breath, letting the moment soak in. It should have been a moment of triumph. Instead, it became something else. He noticed it out of the corner of his eye, an older man in a suit whispering to a flight attendant, casting glances in Jaden's direction. The attendant gave a polite nod, then walked briskly toward the front of the cabin, her eyes flicking to him and away. Jaden brushed it off. He tried to relax. He scrolled through his phone, double-checked his boarding pass again as if it might vanish, and waited for takeoff. Moments later, the same attendant returned, this time with another crew member in a Navy uniform. The second woman wore her authority like armor, her hair pulled back tight, her expression unreadable. "Excuse me, sir," she said with mechanical politeness. "May I see your boarding pass?" Jaden blinked, confused but compliant, and handed it over. She looked at it quickly, nodded to her colleague, and said, "We'll just verify something. One moment." She left with the ticket still in hand. Jaden sat still, stomach tightening. Around him, glasses clinked, soft conversations buzzed, and not a single other passenger was being asked to prove they belonged. A few heads turned toward him. Others pretended not to see. Several minutes passed. Then both attendants returned. "There appears to have been a booking error," the uniformed woman said. "This seat is assigned to another passenger. We'll need to reassign you to a seat in the main cabin." Jaden's brows furrowed. "I booked this seat. I have confirmation. It's my seat." Her tone cooled. "Please don't make this more difficult than it has to be." The words struck like ice. "I paid for this seat," he said, quieter now, glancing around, hoping someone might speak up, but no one did. A businessman nearby smirked. Another shook his head slightly. "Sir," a male flight attendant interrupted, larger than the others, stepping forward like security. "We need you to move now." Jaden hesitated, heart pounding, mouth dry, hands trembling slightly as he reached for his backpack. He stood, refusing to look at anyone. The walk down the aisle was excruciating. He passed rows of staring eyes, whispers, the soft tapping of phone screens, some recording, others pretending to be. Each step felt like a sentence, not just of humiliation, but of judgment. He felt like he was being punished for something unspoken, unprovable, but deeply understood. They guided him past business class, then economy, then even further back. He was assigned a middle seat in the final section of the plane, row 29, squeezed between an elderly man with a cough and a mother rocking a fussy toddler. No apology, no refund, no explanation. He sat, stunned, silent, numb. He didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't protest. He just sat there. As the flight took off, Jaden stared at the screen in front of him, its flickering welcome message unreadable through the fog in his mind. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath him. Something deeper than embarrassment took hold. It was a mix of violation, confusion, and quiet fury. A sense that no matter what he achieved, no matter what he paid for, someone could still decide he didn't belong. He wanted to disappear. The flight attendants passed him without acknowledgement. No drinks, no snacks, not even eye contact. The moments dragged like hours. At some point, he pulled his hood up, not to sleep, but to hide. He remembered something his father told him once. Sometimes, it's not about what you do, it's about what people see when they look at you. At 17, he never truly believed it. Now he did. Unseen to him, a woman in first class had recorded the whole exchange. Camille Daniels, a frequent flyer and quiet observer, had watched in silence as the flight crew targeted Jaden, escalating something that never should have happened. She'd caught the entire thing, the confrontation, the resistance, the escort. She didn't know Jaden. She didn't need to. What she witnessed was wrong. As the plane began its descent, she uploaded the video. Her caption read simply, "Black team kicked off first class. Calm, respectful, still removed." It was that silence that made the humiliation feel permanent, like something carved into his skin. He didn't know that as he crossed baggage claim with his eyes on the ground, the world beyond the terminal was already shifting. He didn't know that Camille Daniels had posted the video on 3 different platforms, that it had already started making its rounds through social media accounts dedicated to justice and inequality, that influencers, commentators, and public figures had started to share it with their followers. He didn't know that, while he boarded a rideshare to his cousin's apartment in Seattle, his name had already begun trending. In the back seat of the car, Jaden sat quietly, fingers curled in his lap. He didn't pull out his phone. He didn't want to see texts from his mother asking how the flight went, didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to explain how something so senseless had happened to him. He had come to Seattle for a tech incubator, one of the most prestigious youth innovation programs in the country. And now all he could think about was how many eyes had watched him being removed like a trespasser. He made it to the apartment and greeted his cousin Darren with a nod, managing a weak smile. Darren, older by 4 years and fiercely protective, took one look at him and knew something was off. Jaden offered no explanation, and Darren didn't press, only told him to get some rest. Jaden lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how quickly a good day had been dismantled. By morning, the storm had fully erupted. The video had gone viral overnight, and now Jaden's name was at the center of a national conversation. The clip was only a minute long, but it told a complete story. A black teenager sitting silently in a first-class seat, being questioned, then forced to move without cause, escorted by flight staff down the aisle under the watchful, indifferent gazes of wealthy passengers. There was no shouting, no resistance, just silent compliance. And still, he had been treated as if he were a threat. Major influencers reposted it with captions like, "This is why we say racism is alive, and being black in America means never being allowed to simply exist." Celebrities began weighing in. A prominent actor tweeted, "This kid did nothing. He had the ticket, he had the seat, and they still made him move. This has to stop." A musician reposted the video with a simple caption, "We see you, Jaden." But not all the responses were supportive. Critics and trolls flooded the comments with messages questioning whether Jaden had really followed protocol. Some asked if he had a counterfeit ticket. Others demanded to know what he had done before the video started rolling, convinced there had to be more to the story. They called him a race baiter, an opportunist. The airline remained quiet for the first few hours of the media storm. Then, at noon, they issued a carefully worded statement. It read, "We are aware of a passenger concern on Flight 227. We are conducting a full internal review. We take seating protocols seriously and deeply regret any inconvenience caused." Inconvenience. That was the word they used to describe what happened to Jaden. Not racism, not discrimination, not even wrongdoing, just inconvenience. That afternoon, Jaden's mother called. Her voice trembled with worry and fury as she asked him what happened, why he hadn't told her, if he was okay. Jaden couldn't explain it. He didn't know how to put it into words that wouldn't make her feel more helpless than she already did. He said he was fine. He lied. At the tech incubator, whispers followed him. Some of the other students had seen the video, recognized him immediately. A few offered awkward nods of solidarity. Others kept their distance, as if unsure whether to approach him at all. One student, a white kid from Boston named Kyle, muttered under his breath during a group session. "It's not like they dragged him off the plane or anything. People overreact." Jaden heard him. Jaden said nothing. That night, reporters started calling. They found his school, contacted his principal, dug through every public mention of his name. One blogger found an old photo of Jaden in middle school after winning a robotics tournament and posted it with the caption, "From promising teen to professional victim." His inbox filled with interview requests. His Instagram flooded with both praise and harassment. He tried to shut it all out, but the story refused to go away. Then came the knock on the apartment door. It was Darren who answered. A local news anchor stood there, camera crew in tow, asking if Jaden would be willing to speak. Darren told them to leave. They waited in the lobby for hours. Jaden sat frozen on the couch, watching a news segment flash across the television screen with his face on it. They showed the video. They dissected it frame by frame. They invited experts to weigh in on the racial dynamics of the incident. One anchor asked, "Why didn't the passenger simply ask to speak with a manager? Was there a misunderstanding?" They talked about him like he was a case study, not a person. Jaden shut the TV off. He didn't eat dinner. He didn't sleep. The next morning, a classmate from his old school sent him a text. "Proud of you. They tried to humiliate you, but they just exposed themselves." Jaden didn't reply. He wasn't proud. He felt ashamed. He hadn't fought back. He hadn't defended himself. He had sat there, silent and small, and let them do it. He hated that. He hated how small he had felt. A few days later, the airline offered him a voucher and a written apology. The letter referred to him as Mr. Cole and said the crew had made a procedural mistake. They offered him a free round-trip ticket and hoped he would continue to fly with confidence. Jaden tore the letter in half and threw it away. Meanwhile, a popular talk show invited him on to tell his story. The host tweeted about the episode in advance. This teen went from first-class passenger to national headline in 24 hours. Don't miss his powerful story. Jaden declined the invitation. He wasn't ready to be anyone's story. He was still trying to understand what had happened to him. He was still trying to understand why being quiet, polite, and compliant hadn't been enough. He realized for the first time that it would never be enough. Their second official statement contradicted the first, now claiming that the flight crew had acted in the interest of passenger safety, citing unusual behavior by Jaden that prompted a review of the seating manifest. No evidence, no specifics, just vague insinuations that suggested he had done something wrong, something potentially threatening, something worth being removed over. News outlets picked up the shift instantly, and suddenly commentators began speculating. Was Jaden Cole really just an innocent teen? One anchor asked. Or was there something we're not seeing? A right-wing pundit on a national morning show leaned forward with that too earnest tone that always preceded a smear. Let's just look at the facts. The flight crew wouldn't remove someone without cause. Could he have been aggressive? Non-compliant? We've seen these situations before. Overnight, new phrases flooded the internet. Hashtag seat scam. Hashtag entitled teen. Hashtag not so innocent. Internet sleuths scoured Jaden's social media profiles, searching for anything controversial, any post that could be twisted, any photo that could suggest rebellion or aggression. They found nothing, but that didn't stop them from trying. One grainy photo of him in a hoodie at night, standing with friends on a city sidewalk, was enough for a popular influencer to post. Something about this doesn't sit right. Not saying he deserved it, but the sentence didn't need to be finished. The implication had already landed. News panels were now stacked with former airline employees, image consultants, and crisis managers analyzing Jaden's expression in the video, arguing whether his silence indicated guilt or composure. We don't know what happened before the video, they repeated like a chorus. We can't rush to judgment. The flight crew involved was now being painted as victims of an online mob. Their photos blurred on screen as anchors reported they were receiving threats and suffering from emotional distress. A legal expert on cable news shook his head solemnly and said, "Social media trials are dangerous. Lives are being ruined over misunderstandings." Jaden watched all of this unfold from the same couch where he had first seen his face on the screen. Darren tried to shield him, turning off the TV, unplugging the router, deleting apps from Jaden's phone, but it was too late. The damage wasn't in the technology. It was in the air, in the weight pressing down on Jaden's chest every time he woke up and remembered what the world now thought of him. He was no longer just a quiet, gifted kid from Atlanta. He was now a litmus test for racial politics, a symbol of either injustice or overreaction, depending on who you asked. People demanded he do interviews, release statements, defend himself, act grateful for the support or apologetic for the controversy. He did neither. He remained silent. He hadn't been given a voice when it mattered, and now they all wanted to borrow it for their own agendas. At the tech incubator, the program director pulled him aside one morning and asked if he might consider stepping back from group projects for a while, just until things calmed down. Jaden nodded, numb, already expecting it. He was placed in a solo corner module, separated from the others, given a different assignment. They called it accommodation. It felt like exile. That same afternoon, a new article appeared online with the headline, "What We Don't Know About Jaden Cole." It was filled with half-truths, anonymous sources, and distorted quotes from teachers and classmates. One former teacher was quoted saying he was quiet, but sometimes seemed angry. A former classmate said, "He never really smiled. You could never tell what he was thinking." The article framed him not as a student, but as a threat hiding in plain sight. It described his hoodie, his reserved demeanor, his reluctance to engage as red flags. He was becoming the antagonist in his own story. One commentator called him the face of modern victim culture, accusing him of using race as a weapon. They called it a seat dispute, a misunderstanding, a procedural hiccup. They refused to call it what it was. Darren raged on his behalf, storming through the apartment, yelling at the television, threatening to sue, to protest, to burn the whole system down if no one else would. But Jaden just sat there, still quiet, still wounded, watching as reality reshaped around him without his consent. What hurt most wasn't the lies. It was how quickly people wanted to believe them. It was how eager the world was to rewrite what had happened, to transform him from victim to suspect, from human being to spectacle. At school, another student approached him in the hallway and asked if the whole thing had been staged. "I mean, it got you a lot of attention," the girl said with a smile. "Pretty smart, actually." Jaden didn't respond. She didn't notice. She walked away satisfied with her own cleverness, not realizing she had just reduced his trauma to a tactic. One evening, Jaden opened his laptop and searched his own name. The results filled with articles, debates, comment sections filled with people arguing about whether he had lied, whether he had overreacted, whether he deserved what happened. Some still defended him, but even those voices began to sound uncertain. "We support Jaden, but we need more facts. If the airline has evidence, they should release it. Maybe it was just a mistake." They were losing faith, and Jaden was losing himself. The truth began to feel slippery, unreal, like something he couldn't hold on to anymore. Even he started to doubt what he remembered. Had he looked angry when they approached him? Had he hesitated too long before moving? Had his silence made them nervous? The questions crawled inside him like rot, eating away at his certainty. That was the real damage. Not the seat, not the video, not even the backlash. It was the slow erosion of his own truth, the steady drip of gaslighting from every direction, until he couldn't tell what parts of his memory were real and what had been redefined by the noise. That was what they wanted. They didn't need to prove he had done something wrong. They only needed people to doubt that he hadn't. Jaden closed the laptop. He stared at his reflection in the darkened screen, his own face barely visible. He thought about deleting everything, disappearing, vanishing from the internet and the world. starting over somewhere no one knew his name. That sentence, simple as it was, hit Jaden like a punch to the ribs. He pulled himself out of bed and walked slowly into the living room, where the television screen displayed his school's logo next to a photo of him from 2 years earlier, an 8th grade yearbook photo, awkward and smiling, paired now with a voiceover narrating disciplinary incidents that were never criminal, never even serious, but now being positioned as red flags. The anchor said Jaden had been cited for insubordination once in middle school after refusing to put away a robotics project during math class, another time for walking out of a group activity when a peer made a racially charged joke. These moments, long resolved and minor in every sense, were now framed as evidence of a pattern, a history of defiance, as the on-screen graphic called it. Darren muted the television with force, then looked at Jaden and said, "They're not going to stop until they bury you." Jaden sat on the couch and stared at the muted broadcast, his own face now paired with a grainy image of the flight attendants who had removed him, their names withheld, their faces blurred, their reputations suddenly protected in ways his had never been. The headline read, "Was flight crew following protocol with troubled teen?" It didn't matter that nothing in his record warranted the word troubled. The damage was in the question itself. By asking it, they allowed people to believe it. The network rolled out interviews with anonymous sources described as former classmates and school insiders who painted Jaden as moody, antisocial, even manipulative. A woman claiming to be a substitute teacher said he once refused to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance and had made her uncomfortable. Another source said he had a chip on his shoulder and acted like he was better than everyone. These statements, unverifiable and laced with coded language, were broadcast without challenge. Social media devoured it. Comment sections overflowed with people now convinced that Jaden was not only ungrateful but dangerous, a manipulator hiding behind his race to gain attention. Hashtags evolved. Hashtag fake victim, hashtag entitled Jaden, hashtag race card kid. The backlash wasn't just from strangers anymore. Parents of other students in the tech incubator began contacting the program directors, expressing concern about Jaden's presence. One email leaked to a blogger read, "With everything going on, I don't feel safe knowing my child is in a lab with someone under investigation." Jaden was never under investigation. He had broken no law. He had raised no voice, made no threat. But fear did not need facts. It needed only suggestion. By the end of the week, Jaden was removed from group activities entirely. The program called it a temporary measure to protect the learning environment. Jaden said nothing. He simply moved to the farthest corner of the lab, plugged in his laptop, and worked in silence. He hadn't come to Seattle for attention. He had come to build something. But now every screen he saw reminded him that the only thing people cared about was the story they wanted him to play. He received emails from people offering to manage his public image, to help him shift the narrative or capitalize on the moment. One even offered to ghostwrite a memoir, promising 6 figures and a media tour. Jaden deleted the messages without reading past the first line. He wanted none of it. He hadn't chosen to be famous, and he didn't trust anyone who saw his trauma as a product to sell. That weekend, someone leaked surveillance footage from his high school hallway showing Jaden arguing with another student who had shoved him during a heated moment months earlier. The video had no sound, but headlines screamed, "Aggressive outburst from viral teen raises questions." No context was given. No explanation that the other student had used a racial slur. No mention that Jaden had walked away moments later without retaliation. Just the image. A black teenager facing off, eyes wide, hands clenched, the very stereotype people wanted to see confirmed. Jaden's former teachers posted statements defending him, praising his intelligence, his composure, his leadership. But those voices were quieter, slower to spread, less dramatic. Outrage traveled faster than truth. Darren started noticing people watching them in public. In coffee shops, on sidewalks. A woman at the grocery store stopped Darren to ask if he was the boy's guardian. When he said yes, she shook her head and said that kid should be ashamed of himself, ruining those people's lives. Darren almost lost control. Jaden pulled him away before he could respond. That night, Darren sat on the balcony with a beer in his hand, the city lights flickering beneath him, and said, "They're rewriting you, Jay. And if you don't push back, their version wins." Jaden didn't answer. He couldn't. He had seen how the world reacted when he was quiet, but he had also seen how it twisted him when he tried to speak. The people defending him wanted him to be perfect. The people attacking him needed only the hint of imperfection. There was no winning, only surviving. A journalist from a respected national outlet contacted him directly, promising a fair profile, a chance to tell his side without spin. Jaden didn't trust her, but he didn't reject her either. He told her he'd think about it. She sent a follow-up email with a list of questions, and one of them stuck in his head. What would you say to people who believe you manipulated this moment for attention? He stared at the screen for an hour. Then he closed the laptop. Across the city, someone spray-painted his name on the side of a building with the words "liar" underneath. Another person edited a meme comparing him to historical hoaxes. A comedian made a viral skit mocking him, complete with fake crying and a boarding pass made of Monopoly money. Jaden watched none of it. Darren did. Darren told him he didn't need to see it. Jaden stayed inside for 4 days. He didn't eat much. He didn't sleep. He thought about deleting every online account he had ever created, erasing every trace of himself from the internet, but he knew it wouldn't matter. They had already made copies of him, distorted and multiplied. They didn't need the real Jaden anymore. They had built a version of him they could control. And still, no one from the airline had called. No apology, no contact, just silence, and a growing legal team preparing to defend what could not be defended. Jaden looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back. His eyes looked tired, older, not angry, not defiant, just empty. He wondered what they would say next. The internet didn't just doubt him, it wanted him to disappear. But buried beneath the noise, something quieter had begun to form. In private chats, in DM threads, in encrypted servers, a different conversation was unfolding, one that didn't rely on breaking news cycles or clickbait headlines. It started with a message from a former flight attendant who had worked for the airline. Her name was Carmen, and she sent Darren a detailed email that included names, time-stamped documents, and internal memos marked confidential. Her subject line was short and unassuming. "He's not the first." Darren read the email 3 times before he showed it to Jaden. Inside, Carmen explained how there had been similar removals over the past 2 years. Passengers of color questioned about their seat legitimacy, asked to present additional proof, moved without justification, and in at least 2 cases, quietly offered vouchers in exchange for non-disclosure agreements. The pattern wasn't public. It wasn't even tracked in official records. But she had kept her own notes, saved her own emails, and now she wanted to hand them over. Jaden stared at the message in silence. Darren asked if he wanted to respond. Jaden nodded. 1 message became 2, 2 became 4, and within days, Carmen connected Jaden and Darren with a small but organized network of current and former airline employees who had grown disillusioned with the company's internal culture. They called themselves the Ghosts. Anonymous, protective, and deeply committed to exposing the quiet machinery of bias that operated in uniforms and lanyards and corporate memos dressed as policies. They didn't want attention. They wanted accountability. One of them sent Jaden a complete copy of the airline's internal incident review procedures, including a hidden sub-protocol labeled High Sensitivity Response Measures. It wasn't officially sanctioned, but it outlined steps for managing potential passenger conflicts with elevated risk profiles. The document included vague descriptors like non-compliance, disruptive behavior, and customer tension indicators, all of which could be interpreted at the discretion of crew leaders. One footnote explained that appearance, perceived demeanor, and passenger reactions may be considered relevant in conflict escalation assessment. In short, they had guidelines that enabled flight staff to remove people like Jaden without needing any objective cause. When Jaden read the line for the 5th time, he put the laptop down and walked to the window, staring out over the city as if seeing it through a new lens. He had known it was personal. Now he knew it was systemic. Carmen arranged for them to speak with a journalist she trusted, a veteran reporter named Iris Duval, who had built her career exposing corporate malfeasance, and whose quiet determination had taken down an entire pharmaceutical board 5 years earlier. Iris didn't send a press team. She didn't tweet about the meeting or bring a camera crew. She showed up with a legal pad, a tape recorder, and a promise. She wouldn't publish anything without proof, and she wouldn't publish anything Jayden didn't approve. He believed her. Slowly, carefully, he told her everything. From the flight to the fallout, from the whispers in the cabin to the messages he hadn't responded to, from the online threats to the death of his voice in the weeks that followed. Iris didn't interrupt. She just listened. When he finished, she opened her notebook and said, "You're not alone in this." She was right. Within a week, Iris's investigation revealed 5 other individuals, 3 black men, 1 Middle Eastern woman, and 1 Latina mother, who had experienced nearly identical treatment on flights with the same airline. Each had been moved without justification. Each had filed a complaint. Each had been dismissed, ignored, or quietly compensated with a forced non-disclosure agreement. None of them had gone public. Until now. With their permission, Iris included their stories in a comprehensive article that was published through an independent platform with no corporate sponsorship. The headline was simple: The Quiet Protocol. The piece dropped on a Tuesday morning and spread like wildfire. It wasn't just another story about one boy on a plane. It was a pattern, an exposed system, a deliberate design to protect a company's image at the cost of dignity and fairness. The article linked to redacted copies of Carmen's documents, audio testimony from a former HR executive, and a timeline of internal decisions that matched the flight Jayden had been removed from. The impact was immediate. The airline issued a new statement that same afternoon, this time claiming the materials were taken out of context and do not reflect the values of the company. But the damage was done. People started asking questions, real ones. Who created the protocols? Who approved them? Why were complaints from minority passengers so frequently dismissed? In the background, an attorney named Eva Martinez, known for litigating large-scale civil rights violations, reached out to Darren. She offered her services pro bono and began building a civil case, not just for Jayden, but for every documented victim the ghost could find. She had a plan, and it was precise. Her team filed motions for discovery. Subpoenas were issued. Former employees came forward, emboldened by the article, offering testimony and data. The case shifted from a personal controversy to a legal reckoning. Jayden remained mostly quiet through it all. He still didn't do interviews. He still refused to post. But he read every line of the article. He watched the system blink in confusion as the truth began to outpace the lies. And for the first time in weeks, he felt something other than fear. He felt momentum. Messages began pouring in from other young people, students, activists, organizers, people who saw themselves in him and who offered not pity, but strength. They told him their stories. They thanked him for surviving. They didn't ask him to speak for them. They spoke beside him. One message came from a boy in Detroit who had been removed from a train for looking suspicious. Another came from a woman in Phoenix who had been followed through a boutique and then banned after questioning the treatment. They weren't just stories. They were evidence of a culture that had trained people to see threat in the color of someone's skin and to use policy as cover for bias. Iris's article gained traction in major publications. Celebrities began sharing it without the sensational captions, focusing instead on the systemic exposure. University groups hosted panels on racial bias in transportation. Legal scholars weighed in. Politicians began to comment. The tide was turning. Jayden remained cautious. He had been burned too recently to trust the warmth. But he no longer felt alone. The silence around him had broken, not with shouts, but with facts, with alliances, with people working quietly and urgently behind the scenes. The world was watching now, but not for spectacle, for accountability. Darren walked into the living room one evening and handed Jayden a printed letter. The lawsuit Eva Martinez filed on his behalf was no longer just about him. It had grown into a class action effort backed by testimonies, documents, and the undeniable patterns of systemic profiling within the airline. With each deposition gathered, With every witness who came forward from behind the company's polished branding and rehearsed customer service language, the illusion of procedural innocence began to fall apart. Executives who once boasted about diversity numbers now stumbled under oath when asked to explain why a higher percentage of black and brown passengers had been reassigned mid-flight compared to white passengers. The high-sensitivity response measures document, which the airline initially denied even existed, had been verified, corroborated, and circulated among journalists and legal experts until it became the face of corporate evasion. Carmen and the other ghosts continued funneling information to Iris and Eva's team. Every new email or policy drafted another crack in the wall. By late spring, the Federal Transportation Oversight Committee announced it would conduct an independent review of airline passenger protocols across major U.S. carriers. This wasn't just a headline anymore, it was a reckoning. And yet, through it all, Jayden remained physically unchanged. He still wore his hoodies, still took walks at night, still rode the subway without a mask or security or fanfare. But what changed was how people saw him. Not just as a victim or even as a symbol, but as the match that lit something larger than anyone had expected. At the tech incubator, the tone had shifted completely. The same administrators who had quietly isolated Jayden were now requesting meetings with him, asking him to rejoin group sessions, telling him he had their full support. He accepted the invitation but brought Darren with him. In the conference room, one administrator offered a clumsy apology filled with phrases like miscommunication and institutional oversight. Jayden listened, nodded once, and said nothing. It was enough. Back in the city, protests began forming, not chaotic mobs, but organized demonstrations led by student groups, legal associations, and civil rights coalitions. Marches lined airport terminals, signs demanding accountability, flyers handed to passengers explaining their rights, organizers holding open forums for travelers to report incidents that had gone unspoken for years. The airline's PR team scrambled to mitigate the damage, launching new campaigns filled with diverse imagery and words like commitment and inclusion. But the public had already seen behind the curtain. Their CEO appeared on a televised interview and repeated the phrase "isolated incident" 4 times in less than 2 minutes, while panelists presented data that made his denial laughable. Stock prices began to wobble. A major investor pulled out of a $2.5 billion partnership deal, citing ethical incompatibility. That announcement did more damage than any protest could. It was money that forced the company's hand. Within days, they suspended several high-ranking executives, including the head of operations and the director of passenger experience. A new equity review board was created with promises of transparency. Jayden was offered a seat on that board. He declined. Instead, he referred them to Carmen and the ghosts. Let those who were ignored for years be the ones to guide change. Still, not everyone was pleased. Conservative media ramped up their attacks, claiming Jayden's story had become weaponized, that corporate America was bowing to a false narrative, that young men like him were now untouchable, unchallengeable, dangerous in their influence. One commentator referred to him as a woke tyrant, despite the fact he still hadn't said a single word on camera. Jayden read none of it. He focused on the work. With Darren and Eva and Iris, he attended strategy meetings, reviewed policy drafts, and quietly worked on a tool that would allow airline passengers to log and report in-flight discrimination in real time using encrypted uploads. He coded it himself, line by line, not as a symbol, but as a builder. It was released under a free license with no branding, just a tool. Just another way to ensure the next kid didn't have to rely on a viral video to be believed. The day the Department of Justice opened a formal inquiry into the airline's internal practices, Jayden was in a coffee shop downtown, drinking a smoothie and sketching out a concept for a hardware device that would allow emergency documentation of public interactions in offline environments. A stranger approached him and said, "Thank you for what you've done." Jayden looked up and simply nodded. No photos, no autograph, just a human moment. The case was still ongoing, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. Networks that once questioned Jayden's integrity now hosted segments on implicit bias. schools started inviting Eva Martinez to speak about institutional justice. Carmen was offered a consulting role in federal policy reform. The ghosts had become a known name in advocacy circles. And Jayden, for all his resistance to the spotlight, became the face of a movement that was never about him, but that had needed someone like him to start. The irony was, the airline had tried to erase him because they thought he didn't belong in first class. Now his presence had redefined what it meant to belong anywhere. He had become too undeniable to erase. In private, Jayden still struggled with the noise. The damage done to his reputation in those early days lingered like a scar across his identity. He hadn't forgotten the humiliation, the gaslighting, the character assassination. He was something more. And now, after everything, the trial, the articles, the protests, the reform panels, the slander, the death threats, the praise, now he was ready to show them. The opportunity came not from a podium or press conference, but from an unexpected source. Iris Duval was invited to deliver a keynote at a national summit on justice and digital equity, and as part of her address, she requested the opportunity to screen a private short film she had commissioned, a 10-minute documentary piece focused on systemic profiling in public transit, highlighting real stories, real victims, and the truth behind the coded language of airline policies. What no one knew was that Jayden had been involved in every second of the film's production, not in front of the camera, but behind it, writing the script, editing the voiceovers, weaving together the timelines, footage, and metadata into a story far larger than his own. He had even coded the interactive backend of the film's companion site, a digital archive called The Manifest, which allowed users to browse anonymized testimonies, explore interactive policy breakdowns, and submit their own documented experiences. The film ended not with narration, but with a visual, a still image of Jayden, taken from the original flight, walking down the aisle after being removed. His face calm, eyes forward, back straight. As the lights in the auditorium rose, Iris stepped onto the stage and, for the first time, spoke the truth that Jayden had kept hidden. "What you just watched," she said, "was designed, edited, and coded entirely by the person at the center of the story. What the airline didn't realize, what the media couldn't comprehend, and what many of us never asked, was who Jayden Cole actually is. Not just what happened to him, but who he has always been." Then she read his credentials. Not the ones tied to the flight or the lawsuit, but the ones buried under it all. Jayden Cole, dual enrolled in college courses since age 15. Jayden Cole, winner of the National Autonomous Systems Design Challenge. Jayden Cole, co-founder of a youth coding initiative that had launched free tech programs in underserved schools across Atlanta. Jayden Cole, finalist in the International Computational Ethics Forum, where his paper on algorithmic racial bias in surveillance systems had been cited in academic journals before he turned 17. Jayden Cole, accepted to MIT on full scholarship before the age of 18, currently on deferment. The room fell silent, not because they had underestimated him, they had done that already, but because they had never bothered to ask. They had looked at the footage, the hoodie, the seat number, and decided they had the whole story. They had told his story without ever asking him for it. Until now. Within hours, the revelation dominated the news cycle. But this time, the narrative didn't spiral into debate. It focused. It solidified. Every accusation of opportunism, every whisper that he had exaggerated or manipulated the moment, now collapsed under the weight of undeniable excellence. This wasn't a boy playing the victim. This was a mind the system had tried to erase. The backlash was immediate, but not toward him. Public outcry targeted the airline anew, not for profiling a teenager, but for profiling a national prodigy. A brilliant mind whose silence had concealed a mountain of qualifications and achievements. People asked if the outcome would have been different had they known who he was. That was the wrong question. The right question was, why did it take genius to justify dignity? Jayden knew this. That's why he had waited. That's why he had said nothing. Because he wanted the world to see what they did to a kid who had done everything right without needing to know he was exceptional. His silence had been strategy. His restraint had been a test. And now, the results were in. Overnight, his inbox filled with invitations. University guest lectures, corporate partnerships, advisory board seats, tech incubator offers, fellowship applications. He declined them all, not out of pride, but because he hadn't done any of this to be seen. He had done it so others wouldn't have to vanish the way he almost did. Carmen and the ghosts called him that night and congratulated him. Eva Martinez wept when she saw the MIT letter reposted in the article. Darren stood in the hallway of their apartment with his arms crossed and said, "I told them not to underestimate you." Jaden finally smiled, not because they knew who he was now, but because they had known all along. The next morning, his face appeared not on gossip blogs, but in academic journals, op-eds, and policy reports. One headline from a legal tech outlet read, "He was always more than a victim." Another from a national educators review asked, "What are we doing to protect our brightest from our deepest biases?" Jaden didn't celebrate. He built. He returned to the lab, refined the documentation app, worked with civil rights groups to develop educational modules based on his experience, and released them under open source licensing so anyone, anywhere could learn. He consulted on data protection policies, helped audit facial recognition software for racial bias, and wrote an anonymized guide for students facing institutional retaliation. All without making a single public appearance. Because now he didn't have to. In the weeks following Iris Duval's keynote and the revelation of Jaden's full identity, the narrative shifted so forcefully that even the most entrenched critics of his story were left speechless, caught in the undeniable gravity of facts they had chosen to ignore for so long. And with that revelation came a reckoning that began as a quiet tremble through the corporate sector and soon escalated into something seismic. The airline that had started this all with one unjust removal found itself flooded with demands, lawsuits, boycotts, and internal resignations. But nothing matched the blow delivered the day Carter Coal Holdings, a private investment conglomerate and one of the airline's largest financial backers, released an official statement terminating a $2.5 billion partnership with immediate effect, citing not only reputational risk, but an irreparable breach in ethical alignment, and what no one knew, not the media, not the airline, not even most of Jaden's supporters, was that Carter Coal Holdings wasn't just another faceless investor. It was a financial legacy built by Jaden's late father, Charles Cole, a reclusive visionary in tech and equity markets, and the same man who had raised Jaden with the knowledge that real wealth wasn't measured in assets, but in the ability to choose when to stay silent and when to strike. That announcement landed like a hammer across the business world, sending stock prices into a freefall, forcing boardrooms to convene in panic, and prompting emergency calls between executives who had once laughed off the incident as a public relations hiccup. News anchors rushed to explain the implications. Headlines screamed of financial collapse, and analysts scrambled to understand how they had missed the familial connection between the silent teenager and one of the most powerful private equity firms in the country. Jaden had hidden the connection for months on purpose, refusing to let his inherited power overshadow the principles he wanted to expose. But now that the truth was out, he wielded that power not like a sword, but like gravity itself. Unseen, irresistible, absolute. Eva Martinez and her legal team, now backed by a tidal wave of financial and public support, filed the second wave of litigation, expanding the lawsuit into multiple jurisdictions, including claims of negligent oversight, racial targeting, and fraudulent reporting. And within days, more whistleblowers stepped forward from other companies, confirming that similar undocumented protocols existed in other sectors, not just in airlines, but in hotel chains, car rental agencies, even university admissions departments. The ripple effect became a national wave. Jaden, without ever raising his voice, had become the catalyst for an entire ecosystem of change. Carmen and the Ghosts launched a nonprofit dedicated to digital transparency and corporate accountability, funded anonymously, but structured to operate with full legal and public oversight. The Manifest, the archive site that Jaden built, now included data visualization tools, policy trackers, and an open-source reporting platform used by travelers across multiple continents. Schools began implementing curriculum built from his case. Civil rights law students studied the litigation strategy. and a new generation of youth activists referenced his name not just as a symbol of survival, but as an architect of systemic disruption. Jaden, meanwhile, stayed exactly where he had always been, off camera, behind the code, in the silence where ideas were born. He spent his days refining tech tools designed to detect bias in automated systems, developing plugins for smartphones that could analyze real-time interactions for discrimination triggers, and publishing encrypted open-source libraries for legal teams to use in case building. But the change wasn't just in systems and headlines. It was in the tone of the conversations that happened behind closed doors, in the hushed strategy meetings at corporate headquarters, in the boardrooms where executives began using the phrase Jaden-level scrutiny to describe the public exposure of hidden policies, in the legal memos that now advised full transparency over plausible deniability, and in the resignation letters quietly submitted by those who had once designed the very frameworks that tried to erase him. Power, once denied him, was now unquestionable, not because of fame, not because of sympathy, but because it had always been his, simply hidden from view, deliberately underestimated by a world that refused to believe brilliance could wear a hoodie and sit quietly in first class. Darren, who had been with him through every hour of silence and every moment of erosion, now watched the city shift around them with a cautious pride, knowing that this victory came not from noise, but from precision, not from revenge, but from strategy. In one of their rare, quiet nights on the balcony, Darren said, "You didn't just survive, Jay. You changed the rules." Jaden didn't respond with words. He simply nodded and looked out at the skyline that had once felt like a wall, and now looked like a blueprint. Not everyone celebrated. Conservative news channels doubled down, calling Jaden's rise a coordinated campaign of elite manipulation, suggesting that his silence had been a carefully orchestrated PR maneuver, that his intellect made him dangerous, that he represented a new kind of threat, an uncatchable one. But those voices grew quieter as facts piled higher. The airline's top executives, once insulated by layers of public relations buffers and internal loyalty, began facing intense scrutiny from federal investigators, civil litigators, and their own boards, as mounting evidence from internal leaks, subpoenaed communications, and cross-reference passenger complaints revealed a decade-long culture of unspoken discrimination hidden under sanitized language like customer security, behavioral protocol, and pre-boarding audit. CEO Margaret Yates, once lauded for record profits and aggressive expansion strategies, was called to testify before a congressional oversight committee after a whistleblower released recordings of closed-door meetings where she allegedly dismissed passenger removal complaints as social turbulence, and when confronted under oath with emails where she had approved budget increases for response training that disproportionately targeted passenger demographics based on race, she attempted deflection but failed under Eva Martinez's direct questioning. And when Eva read aloud the internal memo that referred to the Jaden Cole incident as a PR inconvenience that could be reframed as a customer misunderstanding. If the boy's background remained unknown, the room fell into a silence so thick it trembled. That silence was broken by resignations. Yates stepped down that evening, citing health concerns, followed by the abrupt departures of the Chief Operating Officer, the Director of Security, and the VP of Compliance. Each resignation was accompanied by legally vague statements of transition and retirement, but the public and press understood exactly what had happened. The system Jaden had cracked was not an accident, and those who had designed it were running from a collapse. Civil courts were next. Eva's litigation team filed charges of racial discrimination, negligence, and institutional misconduct not only against the airline, but against named executives whose signatures adorned documents justifying customer removals based on subjective fear rather than verifiable threats. Depositions revealed the use of internal scoring systems, where passengers were flagged based on appearance and assumed temperament, with metrics drawn from flight crew impressions and customer profile algorithms that were never disclosed to the public. One such system, dubbed Pattern Watch, had quietly flagged Jaden as an elevated risk despite having no criminal record, no behavioral violations, and no inconsistencies in his ticketing. Pattern Watch, the lawsuit revealed, had never once flagged a white, first-class passenger. That fact alone became the centerpiece of news coverage for a week straight. The legal consequences weren't confined to the airline. The contractor that had developed PatternWatch, a mid-sized predictive analytics firm based in Texas, found itself under investigation for racial profiling in its software architecture. Emails showed they had ignored internal concerns about demographic bias in the code and continued to sell the product as an unbiased security enhancement. Within days of the exposure, the company's CEO resigned, several of its clients cut ties, and a federal technology ethics board began reviewing all contracts awarded to them in the last 5 years. Meanwhile, Darren, who had remained Jaden's shield and advocate from the beginning, began receiving inquiries from educators and corporate trainers asking if he would be willing to help develop workshops based on Jaden's experience. At first, he laughed, unsure how his role had become so visible. But Jaden told him that the world was finally seeing the value of people who protected others when it wasn't safe to speak. And Darren, moved but steady, began working with civil rights educators to shape a practical guide on how bystanders could dismantle institutional harm without becoming complicit. Even those who had once been minor figures in the original incident faced consequences. The flight attendants involved in Jaden's removal, initially shielded by anonymity and non-disclosure protections, were identified through leaked documents and subject to individual lawsuits for false reporting and emotional harm. While some attempted to issue apologies through carefully worded statements, it was clear they were motivated less by remorse and more by legal exposure. One attendant, caught on a training session recording joking about how easy it was to justify removals when passengers didn't fit the brand image, was terminated and later subpoenaed. The gate supervisor who had marked Jaden's boarding pass for verification without cause was dismissed, and the internal audit that followed revealed he had done the same to at least 14 other black passengers in the last 6 months. That audit was made public, and public outrage followed, not in the form of riots or chaos, but with precision. Organized consumer boycotts, targeted investment withdrawals, and demands for immediate restitution from those affected. Settlement offers poured in from the airline's legal department, but many of the victims refused private payouts. They wanted public accountability, and Jaden had shown them it was possible. At a national legal summit in New York, Eva Martinez presented the case's progress as a landmark model for prosecuting institutional racism without relying on police brutality cases, marking a shift in the justice landscape that emphasized structural discrimination in corporate practices. Universities began teaching the case as part of both law and ethics programs. Corporate leaders who had once brushed off discrimination seminars now scrambled to rebrand their diversity training programs. Policy think tanks began drafting new legislation around transparency in algorithmic profiling and customer scoring systems. Jaden, ever silent, never attended a single press conference. He didn't need to. His presence was in every document, every line of code revealed, every official stripped of title, every law revised. His victory was measured not in attention, but in effect. Still, there were moments when the emotional weight of it all cracked through the precision. Late one evening, Jaden found himself alone in the kitchen, staring at an unopened envelope sent from the airline's board. Inside was an official letter of apology, signed by every remaining executive, accompanied by a formal invitation to meet and advise on their restructured oversight policies. Jaden read the letter once, then placed it on the counter without response. He didn't need an apology built on pressure. What he wanted was change, and change was already happening. Darren walked in, saw the envelope, and asked, "You gonna answer them?" Jaden shook his head. "They've already heard me." By the end of the fiscal quarter, the airline had lost over $1 billion in market valuation. Their new leadership publicly endorsed policy changes designed in collaboration with independent watchdogs, and Carmen's ghosts were offered permanent roles in compliance auditing. Iris Duval was awarded for Investigative Journalism of the Year, and Eva Martinez was nominated for a National Civil Rights Award. The aftermath of accountability rippled far beyond courtrooms and headlines as the dust of scandal began to settle, not in silence, but in recalibration. And for the first time since the day Jaden Cole was forced to stand in a narrow airplane aisle with strangers watching him as if he didn't belong, The systems that once moved without conscience now slowed, hesitated, and began to listen. It did not happen overnight, and it did not happen with fanfare, but in offices where new policies were reviewed line by line, in classrooms where bias was no longer taught as a footnote, but as a flaw in the structure, in board meetings where the question was no longer, how do we protect ourselves, but how do we prevent this from ever happening again? The airline, now under restructured leadership, underwent one of the most comprehensive internal overhauls in corporate history, replacing entire chains of command, discarding decades of internal jargon that disguised harm as procedure, and hiring equity consultants not for optics, but for integration into every operational decision. Carmen was appointed to lead the new Independent Passenger Oversight Council. And for the first time in the company's existence, victims of past discrimination were granted a seat at the table where decisions were made. The flight attendants, who had once followed silent assumptions, now faced new training programs that didn't just teach compliance, but required immersive sessions, led by real people like Jaden, Darren, and others who had experienced firsthand the consequences of unchecked fear and bias. One of them, Maria, who had first confronted Jaden over his seat, requested to attend a session even though she had already been terminated. She sat in the back, said nothing, and at the end walked to the front of the room and asked to speak. Her voice trembled when she admitted she had never questioned her instincts, because the system rewarded her for acting fast, not acting right. She apologized, not in corporate language, but in human terms, and asked how she could begin to make it right. Jaden, seated beside Carmen, didn't answer with words. He nodded once. That nod became a turning point, not just for her, but for the program itself, which transformed into a rotating workshop where past employees who had failed now helped each others how to succeed. The ghosts, once hidden behind screens and pseudonyms, transitioned into formal leaders in transparency initiatives across several industries, advising companies on how to build accountability into the very bones of their structures. Darren's work with educators expanded into a national campaign, teaching students and staff how to recognize and interrupt institutional harm before it metastasized. Eva Martinez was offered a federal advisory role on civil rights litigation, which she accepted on one condition: that all settlements involving racial profiling be made public in both data and narrative. She argued that stories only made change when people could see the cost, not just the number. Iris Duval's documentary became required viewing in over 200 universities. Jaden declined every award offered to him. Instead, he created a foundation under his father's name, the Charles Cole Initiative for Ethical Systems, a nonprofit dedicated to designing open-source technology that monitors and exposes bias in automated systems used by governments and corporations alike. The foundation didn't use Jaden's name in any of its marketing. It didn't need to. Its tools spoke for themselves. And Jaden, for the first time since his removal, traveled again. He boarded planes quietly, wore his hoodie without fear, and took his seat without apology. Not everyone on those flights recognized him. Some did and looked away. Others approached him with gratitude. He greeted both with the same calm, unshaken grace that had defined him from the moment they tried to humiliate him. There were still critics. There were still pundits who argued he had overstepped, that he had manipulated the moment, that he had held too much power for someone so young and so quiet. But their voices no longer echoed. The world had shifted. They were speaking from a platform that no longer existed. In one particularly poignant moment, Jaden received a letter from a former airline executive who had testified against his own company after reading Iris's article. The man admitted that for years he had treated diversity as a box to check, not a truth to live, and that seeing the impact of Jaden's silence had forced him to reevaluate the entire trajectory of his career. He wrote, "I thought I was on the right side because I followed the rules. But you showed me the rules were broken, and silence is not neutrality." That letter joined hundreds of others stored in a digital archive Jaden kept but never displayed. To him, redemption didn't come from confession, but from change. People didn't need to apologize if they were willing to rebuild. Forgiveness, in Jaden's world, wasn't a ceremony. It was momentum. As months passed, stories of transformation began to outnumber stories of outrage. Universities revised their disciplinary protocols. Transportation networks implemented anonymous passenger review panels. Tech companies adopted bias detection layers for their AI systems using the very frameworks Jaden's Foundation had released for free. Change had taken root, not because of one speech, one protest, or one lawsuit, but because one boy had refused to let humiliation define him. Because one boy had endured erasure without erasing himself. Because one boy had chosen to be underestimated long enough to expose the underestimation of an entire system. And in the quiet conclusion of his journey, he walked through the world not as a symbol, not as a victim, and not even as a hero, but as a builder. Someone who saw the cracks, fell through them, and built ladders for others to climb out. He never told the world what to think of him. He made them think about themselves. In that way, Jaden Cole didn't just reclaim his place. He redefined the space. He didn't ask for justice. He created it. And through that creation, the world learned a truth it would carry forward for generations. Silence does not mean weakness. Identity is not a threat. And the measure of a society is not how it rewards the powerful, but how it protects those it tries to erase. The end. If you enjoyed this powerful story and want to see more narratives that challenge systems and uplift truth, make sure to like and subscribe. It helps us keep telling stories that matter. I'd love to hear what you thought about this plot. What moments stuck with you the most? Where are you watching from? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one and would love to connect with you there.